Thank you very much, Kim, for that very kind introduction, and thank you, President Benz, and Brad, Steve, and also Charles Parton. And Charles, if I see you getting up and walking out, I won't be in the slightest bit offended. There are a whole lot of people that it would irritate me that you might stand me up for, but Lady Thatcher is not one of them. I've been suffering from a cold, and so if my voice starts to give way, you could attribute to that. You could also attribute it to my having stayed up last night screaming at the top of my lungs alone over in the executive suite across the way, cheering on last night's victory. I am a partisan Republican. I ran for office as a Republican from the state of Maryland for the U.S. Senate back in 1986. I can't help but feel a little bit like gloating today. But I'm not going to give a partisan speech. I am going to talk more about public policy. Because in a sense, I think last night's election was not simply an election about which party was going to be in control, who was going to be the committee chairman or chairwomen in the various House and Senate committees, or even about who was going to be up or down in terms of 1996 and the electorate. Yesterday was really about ideas, and it was about a political philosophy, and it was about the American public's, I think, registering their discomfort with the direction this nation has been going in the last couple of years. And those issues and those policies are what I'd like to talk about a little bit today. I stayed up until 2:30 last night, in part to gloat a little bit, but also in part because I wanted to hear the outcome of the California election, and not so much the governor's race or even the Senate race out there. I was interested to see what was going to happen on Proposition 187. For those of you not familiar with Prop 187, it was an initiative that was offered on the ballot in California to deny certain welfare and other benefits to illegal aliens. For those of you who haven't seen it in the papers, Prop 187 won by a vote of about 60 to 40. It was almost 2 to 1 in favor. Now, in the interest of full disclosure and fairness, I should tell you that I was not in favor of the wording of Proposition 187. I had reservations about the language of the proposition, certainly not its intent, but the way in which the proposition was worded. I thought it asked a little bit too much of individuals to become government informants and to do the job that I think the Immigration and Naturalization Service should be doing rather than putting the burden not just on employers but also on private individuals. So I wasn't thrilled about the language. But I will say that what Prop 187 and its victory signaled to me is that we are experiencing right now a very significant backlash, not so much per se on the immigration issue, but on what that issue represents in what I call the post-affirmative action welfare state. And that's what I'd like to talk about a little bit today. There really has been a sea change in terms of the public's attitudes on issues related to immigration. In most recent polls, when people are asked what their attitudes are toward immigrants, if you ask them what their attitudes towards immigration of the past was, about 60% of all Americans say they favor immigration of the past. They think that immigrants in the past were a very good thing for this country, that they helped build the country, that they made the country what it is today. If, however, you ask what your attitude is towards the new group of immigrants coming in, you see an exact flip-flop, 180-degree reversal. And 60% of the American public today believes that current immigration is bad for the country. Now, another question asked on some public opinion polls is whether or not people believe that today's immigrants are interested in a melting pot society or whether they are interested in a society which basically divides along ethnic and racial lines. Only 20% of the American people believe that today's immigrants are interested in a melting pot. And I think that answer on that particular question in fact, is responsible for that 60% negative view of immigrants in general. The question is whether or not we remain a melting pot or whether or not we've reached the boiling point in terms of immigration and its effect in this society. Now, I guess the real question is what to make of this change. Why is it that people feel so differently? Well, if you talk to the people out in California who were opposing 187, they will tell you it's because people are racist. They don't like brown people, they don't like Asians, they don't want the new people who are coming in. And indeed, there has been a dramatic change in the composition of who is coming in to this country as immigrants. Since 1965, we have seen a real reversal. It used to be most of our immigrants were European and were, by today's standards, white, although if you go back and look at the way people viewed Italians and Greeks and Poles and Jews and others at the beginning of the century, they were hardly embraced as fellow Europeans. There was a lot of prejudice towards immigrants from those nations. Today, 85% of all immigrants come either from Latin America or from Asia. And there are those out there who say the reason we have such anti-immigrant feelings about today's immigrants is that these people are not white, and therefore we don't want them coming. Well, as I say, it is true that they are different in terms of their racial composition, but it is my view that it is not so much the difference in ethnicity or race of the current immigrants and the change in attitudes that we're experiencing, as it is that America is a very different place today than it was in 1913. We live in a post-affirmative action welfare state. We live in a society in which rewards are given on the basis of race and ethnicity, in which it is a matter of public policy to grant preferences on the basis of skin color, in which it is a matter of public policy to try to reinforce ethnic identity, and in which we believe that all persons who live here have entitlements to certain benefits. And it is, in my view, those things that have changed most dramatically. And I'd like to talk about a few of those this afternoon. In the early part of the century, when immigrants were coming from many different language groups, there was no question whatsoever that once they were here and once they went into the public schools, that their first and immediate obligation was to learn English. And in fact, our entire public school system was geared toward teaching children who were the children of immigrants the English language. And in fact, classes were offered at night so that the parents who might be out working in factories or sweatshops or whatever during the day would have an opportunity to learn English so that they could advance themselves. Since 1968, it has been federal policy that we no longer promote the idea as a matter of national interest of helping those who come from non-English speaking backgrounds to learn English. The federal policy in that regard is to promote the concept of bilingual education, that a new child coming into the school system who doesn't speak English should not be required to learn English, that in fact it was instead the obligation of the school system to teach that child in his or her native language. And we have seen what started as a very small and experimental program in the late 1960s balloon into a multi-billion-dollar program that is now used to teach children in their native language. And there is no place in the country where this has happened with greater impact than in the state of California. In California now, you have 167,000 students in the Los Angeles school system who are being taught primarily in Spanish. They are being taught, by the way, from textbooks that have been donated by the government of Mexico, because the state of California didn't have enough Spanish language textbooks to use. And some of them are being taught by Mexican nationals who are teachers who, again, have been lent to the state of California by the government of Mexico. What's more, not only are these children being taught for a short period of time in the Spanish language, they are being instilled with a sense of their ethnic identity and with encouragement to retain a sense of a strong attachment to their ancestry. Rather than being helped to learn about the new country in which they will build their lives, to be taught the new heroes of this culture, they are being reinforced in terms of their own ethnic heritage. Ironically, some of the newest immigrants from Mexico don't speak Spanish. They're Mayan and other Indian groups who for 500 years the government in Mexico has tried to force to speak Spanish, but for 500 years these Indians have resisted learning Spanish, but lo and behold, the state of California and the city of Los Angeles will instruct those children in Spanish. And probably for the first time, some of them will become Spanish speaking. It's policies like this that have got people up in arms and are causing what I think could become an unfortunate backlash. I think what we are seeing now is that people are essentially fed up. They're fed up with the extra money that these programs cost. And I think people, the American people, are very generous people, and I think if they believed that these programs were in some way benefiting small children who need extra help, that they'd be willing to support it. But the fact is that the programs don't help. The children don't keep up in their classes. The children don't do better on standardized tests. The whole argument for teaching these children in Spanish was that it was a way to ease their transition into English, and we could teach them to read and write and add and subtract in Spanish while they learned English, so that they didn't fall behind. Lo and behold, when there have been evaluations done of bilingual programs, it turns out that they're not any better at reading and writing and adding and subtracting, even though they've been taught those things in Spanish. So it is a program that has failed to achieve its goals. It's not just the language area or even the way the language area intercedes in other programs. We now have, as a matter of federal law, the right to vote in federal elections in certain jurisdictions in the U.S. using a ballot in Spanish or another half dozen other languages. This is a matter of federal law. It's been the federal law since 1975. You can actually go and vote in a federal election in a ballot other than English. Now, anyone who knows anything about immigration law knows that if you don't speak English, it is, unless you are over 55 years of age, you can't become a naturalized citizen. Nonetheless, the federal government passed this law in 1975, ironically not so much to help provide assistance again to people who don't speak English, but as a way to get the Federal Voting Rights Act to be applied to jurisdictions where there were persons of Hispanic background, American Indians, and Asian Americans. It was a law that was originally intended primarily to deal with the problems of the denial of the right to vote of blacks in the Deep South, and in 1975 it was amended to include some of these other groups in order to have the federal government begin to dictate the way in which district lines were drawn, the way in which elections were held, and essentially for the federal government begin to intrude on state voting procedures. Again, this is another kind of reaction that I think we're seeing. Finally, I think that in terms of the kind of backlash that's developed, I think one of the reasons that Proposition 187 received such a high vote in California is that the opponents who fought the enactment of Prop 187 decided to take to the streets of Los Angeles and other cities. And 2 weeks ago, about 2.5 weeks ago, 70,000 Mexican American, Mexican nationals, Central Americans and others took to the street to demonstrate against Prop 187. Now, that's a time-honored American tradition. There's nothing wrong with taking to the streets to demonstrate your approval or disapproval of a particular act. But when you do so under a Mexican flag and shouting "Viva la Raza," you shouldn't be terribly surprised that a lot of the people who were watching those demonstrations decided all the more that they were going to go out and vote for Prop 187. One of the ironies is that in the number of years that I've spent studying the Hispanic population in the United States, which has been almost 20 years now, it's been very clear to me that the Hispanic population in the United States is by and large a pretty conservative population. Bilingual education does not exist because there's been this massive outpouring of public support in the Hispanic community for bilingual education. Bilingual education exists because the self-appointed leaders in the Hispanic community have decided that this was a terrific program and a way to create jobs, and particularly to create jobs for middle-class Mexican Americans and other Hispanics who already speak English in order to provide them some security in the school system. And so these programs, which were created by an elite, and often an elite that was already pretty well assimilated, have now been foisted on a group of people who are not well organized and have difficulty resisting this. What we're seeing in some places, we saw it in New Jersey, we've seen it in California and elsewhere, is that when immigrant parents find out that their children aren't learning English at school, they get upset. They know darn good and well that those kids are going to be bussing tables and cleaning other people's houses and digging in gardens and emptying garbage and never doing anything that requires a college degree if they don't learn English. The path into the mainstream middle class in the United States today, as it has always been, is a path that requires people to learn the English language. Immigrants know this. They want that for their children. But what often happens is that they go down to the school system and they begin to inquire about, why Juan or Maria is in a Spanish language class instead of an English language class, and they're patted on the head and told by the principal or by the counselor or by the bilingual teacher, you don't understand. This is good for your children. This is the way they're going to learn English. And often dealing with a population that is not well educated, that is very respectful of authority, they don't know what to do, and so they retreat. The way in which our laws are written, immigrant children are put into those classes without their parents' assent. They are automatically assigned to the classes, and it takes some extraordinary effort in order to remove the children from that class. Now, I'm not an immigrant. My family has lived in New Mexico since the early 1600s, and I obviously speak English. You'll determine how well I speak it, but English is frankly my first language. Yet when my middle child went to school, my middle child's name is Pablo. He was named for my favorite uncle. And when he went off to school in the District of Columbia, I got sent a note home in Spanish informing me that he was going to be put into a bilingual classroom. The boy, despite his name being Pablo, didn't speak a word of Spanish and was one of the most articulate 6-year-olds you'd ever want to meet. But the school system decided that since his name was Pablo and his mother's name was Chavez, that must mean he needed Spanish. And of course I was able, because I am college educated, I do know how the system works. I wrote a letter saying thank you very much, but no thank you. And he was not placed in that class. Until 1988, that was the state of federal law. You could be put into a class simply on the basis of your name. The school could determine that you belonged in a bilingual class. And in fact, many of the children that are in these bilingual classes are English monolingual. Most Hispanics in the United States who have been here at least 3 generations speak only one language, and that one language is English. Like every other immigrant group before them, by the 3rd generation, they have moved into the English-speaking mainstream. So that, I think that is one of the reasons you've seen this kind of backlash. It seems to me very clear that we hear a lot about multiculturalism today. We hear a lot about what a multicultural society we are. I want to tell you, I think that's nonsense. We are not a multicultural society. We are a multi-ethnic society. We are multiracial. We come from many different ancestry groups, and just looking around this room, we look very different from each other. It's not to say that we don't have a single culture. We share an American culture. And anybody who doubts that ought to try going back to their ancestral homelands. I once said this before a university audience, and one of the students raised his hand in the back, and he was an African American, and said, I'm not an American, there's no such thing as American culture. And I said, well, if you and I were to get on a plane right now and end up in Nairobi, Kenya, I can tell you that the people in Nairobi would look at the 2 of us and think both of us were American and have more in common with each other than you have with people in Africa. And as it turns out, there aren't very many African Americans today, unless they're more recent immigrants, who trace their roots back to Nairobi, Kenya, because most blacks in the United States came from people who lived in West Africa, not in East Africa. So it is, this idea that somehow a Chinese American and a Mexican American and an African American all, have a whole lot in common with their ancestral homelands is really nonsense. They have much more in common with each other and with the larger European-based population in the United States than they do with anyone from those ancestral homelands. John O'Sullivan, who is the editor of National Review, has an article in this most recent issue of the magazine about the immigration issue. And John and I disagree a little bit about what we ought to do in terms of immigration policy. He would like to see a cessation or a real restriction in terms of legal immigration to the United States. I don't happen to think that we are quite at that point yet. I think we can, in fact, still welcome immigrants to the United States. But we can do it only if we are willing to say that we are a melting pot society and that we expect assimilation. That's part of the contract as far as I'm concerned. We open our doors, we welcome people. All you have to have is drive and initiative, be willing to work hard, to be willing to take care of yourself. But you have to also want to become an American. That has been the great history of this country. We cannot afford to fragment into different and competing racial and ethnic groups. We will lose who we are as a nation. This cannot be simply a nation built on an idea. Yes, our Constitution is important. Yes, the principles that we hold dear are important. But there is such a thing as an American culture. We have our own language. It is English, and it's not just English, it's American English. Again, try talking to someone from England. I'm sure, Charles, you'll get that opportunity with Mrs. Thatcher. When we begin to use colloquialisms, their colloquialisms are different from ours. We have our own language. We have our own history. George Washington is the father of my country. The fact that when my family lived here in the early 1600s and 1700s in northern New Mexico, the fact that they were at that time Mexicans does not mean that I'm not an American today. My family decided to stay. They were given an opportunity after New Mexico was acquired with the war with Mexico. Everyone living, there were 60,000 people living in New Mexico at the time, almost all of whom were of Mexican origin or Indian. They were given the opportunity. You have the choice. You can become an American citizen. You can retain Mexican nationality. Some members of my family left and went to Mexico. My particular branch of the family stayed, and we became American. And as early as 1870, when I went back and looked at census records for New Mexico, I found my great-great-grandfather, Francisco Armijo, and on that census record, it lists whether or not he could speak English. In 1870, my great-great-grandfather spoke English. My great-great-grandmother did not, as was common at the time. Men were much more likely to acquire the language because they were out in the work world. This country and this history belongs to all of us, no matter where our ancestors came from, no matter what part of the world, no matter what color our skin is. And I think we are in danger of losing this sense of who we are as a nation unless we are willing to articulate that, unless we are willing to say yes to immigration, but no to multiculturalism. I don't think you can have them both. I think there's a choice to be made. Now, the folks who were fighting Prop 187 made very clear what their views were on that choice when they marched under the Mexican flag and when they shouted "Viva la Raza." That was their choice to make, but that is a very different history than this country has experienced. Now, having said that, some people say, well, then does that mean that we all have to sort of go into the melting pot and melt down and everybody is going to have exactly the same practices and exactly the same kind of traditions? We have always been a very tolerant country. There have always been pockets of people who celebrated their holidays differently, who practiced different religions, who ate different foods, who in fact spoke different languages at home. And there is nothing wrong with the sort of private celebration of what it is that makes us unique as a family, as a person, as an individual. That has always been tolerated and allowed in the American system, and I don't think that we should do things to discourage that. But that's a very different thing than saying that it should be public policy that we are going to elevate these ancestral attachments, and that the policy of our schools is going to be to promote an idea that we have no common culture, that we have no common language, that we have no common traditions or history, but that we are just this sort of convenient conglomeration of people who all happen to find ourselves within the borders of the United States of America at this given time. That is a recipe for the dissolution of ourselves as a nation. And I believe we must begin to do things in terms of our public schools and in terms of our public policy that move us back to the sense that we are one nation and that we are one people. And that begins first and foremost in the schools. It begins at the formative stages. It means that immigrant children who come to the United States ought to be treated compassionately. It would be nice to have people in the school who understand the child's language so that when they raise their hand, they know how to ask to go to the bathroom or where to go to the next class. But those children have to immediately begin to be immersed in their new language so that they will be able to have the tools to succeed. It's fine if you want to celebrate your own holidays or join an ethnic association in your spare time and have your community halls and celebrate German history or Lithuanian history or Mexican history or whatever. But when it comes to a sense of what our common history is and what that shared tradition is, we have to understand that it is shared and that it is common. It isn't entirely white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. There are parts of American culture that are contributed from other groups. Jazz, which is the sort of quintessential American music, is a contribution from African Americans. Film would not be the medium it is today if it weren't for the contribution of Russian Jewish immigrants early in this century. So American culture takes from other groups and takes from the participation of the many people who helped build this country. But it is something we share in common. And jazz is every bit as much my music as it is a black American's. Film is every bit as much my medium as it is those of Russian Jewish descent. So this is the notion that I think we need, again, to be reinvigorating in our schools. It means that we need to teach history that recognizes the contributions of everybody who helped make up the country, but it also means that we need to have a very clear notion of the history of the importance of ideas and the importance of the people who helped build this country and the contributions of many who were, in fact, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males. That happens to be who our founders were. Their traditions came from England. Most of them came from England. Many of the ideas of the Enlightenment, which they found and brought to fruition here, were ideas that came from the European continent and most particularly from England. We don't need to pretend that's not so. There is nothing about that idea that people whose ancestors don't come from England should find threatening. The idea that we are a nation that is ruled by a concept of the rule of law, that we are a nation that believes that the power of government rests in the people, that we're a nation that believes in the equality of the individual, that believes in private property, that believes that when one is accused of a crime, that one has the right to face one's accusers and to be tried by a jury of one's peers. These are all notions that came to us from a very specific place at a very specific time, and we should not pretend otherwise. And students need to understand that in our public schools. Finally, I guess I'd like to say just a few words about why it is I think that the notion of immigration per se should not be viewed as the threat that some people worry about, so long as we have an assimilationist ideal, so long as we know that we are welcoming people here, but that they will in fact become Americans. If you look at the immigrant pool that is coming to the United States today, it is true that in terms of education levels, the Latin immigrants in particular fall behind the current U.S. population. But that has generally been the case with immigrants throughout our history. People usually come here because they're closer to the bottom of the economic ladder, and the whole reason that they come here is they want to climb that ladder. They want the opportunity to be able to use their strong backs and their hard work and their willingness to save and sacrifice in order to be able to build better lives, not just for themselves, but more importantly for their children. All indications are that that is in fact happening, even with Hispanic immigrants and even against this public policy onslaught that tries to teach their children in Spanish and tries to make them feel that they are in fact different and ethnically different from the U.S. population. In a book I wrote a couple of years ago called Out of the Barrio, Toward a New Politics of Hispanic Assimilation, I documented that within 3 generations, Mexican Americans did what every other group before them has done. They move up the ladder and into the economic mainstream. In terms of their education levels, the average Mexican American, that is one born here in the United States, has a high school completion rate that looks pretty much like that of non-Hispanic whites. About 80% of all Mexican Americans graduate from high school. About 90% of non-Hispanic whites do. So there's a little bit of a gap, but it's not huge. In terms of earnings, when you adjust for the education levels of the Mexican American population, the earnings levels of non-Hispanics and Mexican Americans are identical. There are no differences. A Mexican-American male with 15 years of education earns 97% of the average wages of a non-Hispanic white male of a similar age. So those kinds of differences disappear. I've already mentioned that there is the transition in terms of language to the language norm. More than half of all third-generation Hispanics in the U.S. speak only one language, and that language is English. And about a third of all those third-generation young people will marry people outside their group. They will marry Irish and Italian and German and other ethnic heritage Americans. That kind of assimilation, which is sort of the ultimate test of assimilation in terms of intermarriage, is proceeding apace. So I think that to be optimistic, that assimilation is a very strong pull in this country, and that so long as we can get the people who are in Washington and the people who are in state houses and the heads of education agencies around the country to recognize that most people who come here do indeed want to become American, that assimilation will take place quite naturally, as it always have. If we are not able to change those policies, if we still find ourselves committed to trying to increase separateness, to try to make people feel different, to try to make people hold on to their ancestral ties, then I think we will see the kind of immigrant backlash that we have not seen since the early part of this century. I hope that doesn't happen. I hope that we continue to see ourselves as a welcome and generous country, but I also believe that we must be continuously on guard and continuously committed to the notion that we are one nation and that we are one people. Thank you very much. Sure, I'll repeat the question so those of you who didn't hear. The question is that Prop 187 probably will be challenged in the court, and the question is, what is the basis of those challenge? There are three general provisions in Prop 187. One says that there shall be no welfare benefits given to illegal aliens. Well, that happens to be a matter of federal law now. You cannot receive welfare benefits if you're an illegal alien at all, and you cannot receive welfare benefits if you are a legal resident alien in the United States for the first 5 years of being here. So that provision, which I think is what caused the most strenuous fervor, is in fact already a part of law. The other two provisions would deny general medical service to illegal aliens and would deny education. And it's the education provision that's probably going to be challenged first. In 1982, there was a Supreme Court decision called the Plyler versus Doe decision. It came about as a result of a Texas law back in the late 70s or early 80s, in which the state legislature in Texas decided that there were an awfully lot of kids in the public schools in Texas who were there by virtue of their parents having crossed the border illegally, crossed in some instances the Rio Grande, and that the school system was being forced to educate these kids. And the state legislature offered what I thought was a not terribly draconian measure. It's essentially said that we're not going to kick your kids out of school, but you're going to have to pay a modest tuition. It was a matter of a few $100s that was being asked as tuition for these students under the notion that their parents didn't contribute to the tax base. They weren't property owners, and therefore they were getting a free education, and the state legislator said you're going to have to pay for part of it. I didn't think that was such a terrible thing, quite frankly, but the Supreme Court of the United States disagreed with me, as they often do, and they struck it down as unconstitutional. What they said was there is no constitutional right to a free public education in the United States, but those states that do, in fact, provide such an education cannot distinguish between people on the basis of their national origin or their legal status. And there was a lot of language in that. It was Justice Brennan who wrote the decision, and he had all of this sort of warm, fuzzy notion about these kids are going to live here, and so we better educate them or else they're going to become wards of the state. I was not thrilled with that decision when it was handed down, but nonetheless it was handed down. Now some people think that when this Prop 187 is challenged that there may be a chance to reverse it. I wouldn't hold my breath. I think it probably will be struck down again as unconstitutional. Right. Well, for those of you who might not have heard it, she doesn't. She has a very long string of all of the ethnic, religious, and political identities that that go along with her. My children are the same. My husband is Jewish. I'm Catholic. My father was of Mexican origin. My mother is of English and Irish origin. So my kids are English, Irish, Mexican, Jewish, you know, and who knows what else. And they're also conservative Republicans too. I think part of the problem is when you have public policies which say that who gets admitted into an education program or who gets hired in a job, or even there's a new proposed regulation that will require banks that want to lend small business loans of $1 million or less to inquire into the racial and ethnic and gender makeup of the board of directors or whoever owns the company that's applying for a loan. Every time you turn around, you're asked to identify who you are. The census form itself, you know, we've always had ancestry and ethnic origin questions on there ever since we've had immigrants coming in, and certainly it goes back to earlier in the century. But what was really an amazing change was the 1980 change, which all of a sudden divided people. You had to answer the question whether or not you were Hispanic. It was the first question you answered. Are you Hispanic or not? You know, which to me was sort of weird. We're talking about a part of the population which at that time was about 6 or 8% of the population, and for the other 94, you know, or 92% of the population to have to identify themselves in terms of what they were not seemed to me very weird. But we are constantly being required to provide that kind of information. And young people today have grown up at a time when they just take it for granted that they have to answer those questions. I hate to admit it, old enough to remember when that wasn't the case. You know, I can remember when it would have been considered a horror to have to identify your ethnic origin. In fact, I have a very clear memory of being a 9-year-old moving from New Mexico to Colorado and being asked by my 4th grade teacher what my nationality was. And I was horrified. I mean, I stood up and naively said American, and that clearly was not the answer she was looking for. She wanted to know what my ethnic background, and it probably was an indication of her ethnic prejudice. And that was, you know, I was always viewed in that way in those days. You know, people didn't used to be able to require pictures on employment applications, or those employers that did require pictures often did so in order to eliminate people on the basis of their race or ethnicity. Now we've gone 180 degrees the other way, and we're being told that this is good and that we're doing this because we want to promote the idea of equality. Well, I don't think distinguishing people on the basis of their outward characteristics made sense when it was used to keep blacks out of the workplace, or blacks from voting, or blacks from living where they wanted. And I don't think it's a good idea when it's being used in order to reverse that and to give people preference on the basis of being a member of a racial or ethnic minority.
Is he having an effect with his peers?
I don't think that Arthur Schlesinger is having as much of an impact in the academic community. I spent a lot of time on university campuses. I do a lot of speaking at universities, and I will tell you that the multicultural idea is alive and well on university campuses. And it's more than just race and ethnicity. It's very much ideology. If you happen to disagree, if you are not in tune with the orthodoxy of the ethnic and racial establishment, you are basically don't have a voice and aren't heard. I have had a number of universities where I've been invited to speak, and then someone on the faculty will object and they don't like my views on bilingual education, or they don't like the fact I serve in the Reagan administration, and I get disinvited. Occasionally they go ahead and let me come, but then there's, you know, a crowd of angry protesters and people with pickets outside to protest my speech. So unfortunately, that battle, as it's being waged in most universities, and some of them even, you know, in rural areas and in places that I would think were sort of the bedrock of conservative America, I often wonder what would happen if the parents of the students ever had any idea what goes on the students' campuses. And as I was telling President Benz, I found myself as a mother of, I have one son who's already graduated from college and one in college now and one about to go to college, that one of the best experiences for me as a mother was the opportunity to go and check out all these universities. And I would not send my son, any of my sons, to Stanford University. I don't care if they gave me twice the cost of the tuition. I wouldn't send them there because of what I saw on those campuses. So unfortunately, I can't be optimistic about that. Things have not turned around there. It's going to take people being aware. It's going to take alumni and parents learning and understanding what's happening. My middle child, the infamous Pablo, who's now at James Madison University in Virginia. James Madison, for those of you who didn't see the controversy a couple weeks ago, the student council there voted not to allow the Pledge of Allegiance at the beginning of student council meetings. Well, apparently some of the parents, not just me, were upset enough to write letters, angry letters to the president, and they decided to put it to a vote of the whole student council, and lo and behold, they reversed themselves and they've got the pledge there now. But that's because parents got involved and they said, I don't want my money going to support that kind of attitude. Any more? Going.
Well, I don't think we can let Ms. Chavez get away without giving some kind of post-mortem on what happened yesterday. And how will that affect immigration policy?
Well, it's going to be very interesting to see how it affects immigration policy. I mean, I would like to see it affected by all those folks that were out in the streets of Los Angeles with high school kids, skipping classes in order to carry the Mexican flag in protest. I would like to see them get a real wake-up call and decide that they have a clear choice to make. Either they can continue to promote these nonsense policies and they can see the door slammed, not just on illegal immigration, but on legal immigration as well, that they are going to provoke such a backlash that they're going to see this become a very ungenerous time. Or they're going to wake up and realize that maybe their leaders have been misleading them on these issues and that they better start thinking about the old notion of the melting pot. I think it's going to have an impact on that. I think immigration is going to be a very hot political topic for the next 10 years. I think that we're going to see a lot of movement towards trying to do something about illegal immigration. My fear is that we not react in ways that violate conservative principles and do things that I think will be counterproductive. There's a proposal offered by Senator Alan Simpson, one of my very favorite people in Washington, but I think he's wrong on this, to have a national ID card. He wants, the recent Commission on Immigration Reform came out with the idea that there should be a bureaucracy set up where every single American employer, when you're about to hire somebody, you have to call up a number and you get told whether or not that person has a right to work or not in the United States. Any of you who think that's a good idea, I challenge you to do this when you go back to your office. Find the number of the INS and give the INS a call and see if you can even get through. I mean, imagine the kind of bureaucracy that would create. We've got a problem. We've got about 1% of the population that's here illegally, but I don't think we want to put in place something that affects the other 99% and places enormous new burdens on employers and burdens on potential employees who have the right to work. In order to get at that 1%. I think we'd be much better off doing much more vigorous border enforcement, much more vigorous enforcement at the airport, and maybe even going back to the idea, I know when I was growing up, if you were here as a resident alien in the United States, you had to register once a year. It's the way the INS kept track of you. You know, I go to Europe every summer, and I spend the month in Geneva, Switzerland. When I check into a hotel, I have to present my passport, and the police department in Geneva is notified of my presence there because I'm an alien in Geneva. The fact that people who are here legally, that we keep track of them, I think that's a lot less draconian, again, than this notion that every single American has to begin to carry an identity card. So I hope that happens. In terms of the overall post-mortem on the election, this is going to be a real opportunity for the Republican Party, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed, my toes crossed, and my prayers bombarding heaven's gates that we don't blow it. I think that this is an opportunity to define what it is that Republicans stand for, and that we're not just against things, although there's good reason to be against a lot of things, but that we have a clear idea of the direction we want to lead the nation. I think if we meet that challenge, if we are able to roll back some misguided programs, if we're able to hold the level on spending, if we're able to reduce taxes, if we're able to come up with a meaningful crime bill, if we're able to do the things that people send legislators to Washington for, then I think the prospects for the Republican Party are terrific. This, in my view, is Reagan 3. Someone else said that this is Ronald Reagan's third victory. And I must say, Steve, I appreciated your words about President Reagan. I worked for President Reagan in the White House for a year, and I think I feel very, very saddened by what has happened to him. But one of the things about Ronald Reagan that people don't appreciate is that his ideas, his philosophy lives on, and I believe it will become the dominant political philosophy of the 21st century in America. Thank you again.